Hi, this is Irma Baker, and I'm welcoming you to our show. We're sponsored by RSVP, the Retired Senior Volunteer Program. That's a part of Mature Services. Now, a kaleidoscope, according to the dictionary, offers a constantly changing group of bright objects. This is what we hope to accomplish with these programs. We're highlighting interesting organizations, activities, and people in our viewing area. After these messages, we'll be right back to meet our guests.
RSVP of Summit County has been making a difference in our community since 1972. RSVP volunteers are increasing the quality of life by participating in programs and organizations that provide important services to the community. RSVP matches personal interests and skills with opportunities to serve. If you're interested in adding more meaning to your life and improving the lives of others, please call 330-253-4597, extension 166.
I want to welcome our guests today. We have with us Peggy Brannigan-Smith and Shannon Smith. Now, Peggy is a Wadsworth girl, but she's gone far, far from our local environs here, really all around the world. And the way she's done that is by marrying an astronaut. Peggy, I'm so glad to have you here, and you brought along your lovely daughter Shannon.
Yes.
And I know you have a son at home too, Brian.
Yes.
Couldn't be with us today, but we're certainly glad to have you here with us. And we'd like to know a little bit about what it's like to be the family of an astronaut. Tell us a little bit first about Steve. Now, I know that he had 4 space missions.
Yes.
And multiple spacewalks, but one of those walks, not a spacewalk, but a church walk, was walking down the aisle with you. How in the world did the two of you get together? You, the Wadsworth girl, and Steve from San Jose, California.
Well, we met in California. So Steve's from San Jose, and he had applied to go to business school at Stanford, and I did also. So we met at the Graduate School of Business, and I actually didn't meet him until the last part of the second year. So he says he always sat up near the top of the deck and watched what was happening with the professors. I always sat right down near the front because I'm much shorter than him. He's about a foot taller than me. So it was maybe just lucky fate that we actually did get together, but we met right at the end of business school, just as he was getting ready to apply to go to work for NASA, and I was applying to go to work in Washington, D.C.
Was it a whirlwind romance, or was it, well, let's see if we like each other?
I think we decided we liked each other quite a bit right away. And unfortunately, as I said, we were just finishing business school, so we had to make some decisions about what was next. And for him, it was really clear that he wanted to go to work in Houston for NASA because he was applying to be an astronaut. And he felt like his chances would be much better if he were actually in Houston working and could show them that he was a good candidate. I had no intention of moving to Houston. That was not on my radar screen. I was interested in international politics, and I wanted to go to Washington, D.C. But, well, I was interested in international affairs. Fortunately, I took a job with Apple Computer in their international group in San Jose in the Silicon Valley. So we had a chance to spend some time together in California before Steve moved to Houston.
When did you actually get married?
We got married in 1989, and the funny thing is, it was quite an unusual arrangement. We got married, and then Steve immediately got on an airplane after our honeymoon and moved to Houston to start work for NASA. I didn't. I stayed in California. We thought it was just going to be for 6 months while he got established in Houston, and I stayed working for Apple Computer. But it turned into a 3-year commute because he was applying to join the astronaut corps. And that's about a 2-year process to apply. And so during that time, we wanted to keep our foot on the ground in both places. So I stayed in California and worked for Apple Computer and actually had a chance to travel around the world for them. I worked in Mexico and in Hong Kong and helped them set up businesses in Asia and South America. Meanwhile, Steve was in Houston getting his career established with NASA and working his way through the astronaut application process. So it's a really unusual way to start a marriage. And I wouldn't recommend it, but we managed to keep together and keep going with the marriage because we made a commitment at the beginning of each year that we were going to see each other several times each month. So we spent a lot of money with Continental Airlines to commute back and forth between the Bay Area in California and the Bay Area in Texas.
Well, and with your international travel, it was kind of like, well, I think I'll stop off in Houston and see Steve.
I was very lucky that at that point I was working in South America and I had to go to Brazil and Mexico quite often, and Houston is a natural stopover on the way. So I could route my trips through Houston and say hello to him and then fly down to South America.
Well, growing up here in Northeast Ohio, what were your plans? What were your dreams? Did you dream about traveling all over the world or marrying an astronaut?
I did. I didn't have any inkling about marrying an astronaut. That came much later. That was a happy surprise. But I knew from the time I was very young that I loved the idea of learning about the world and all the different people and the different languages and costumes and religions and histories and different ways of looking at how the world works. I'm not sure why, but I was quite interested from an early age. I had a doll collection, and it's still at my parents' house. And any time a traveler in our family would go to a different country, they would bring me back a doll. And it sort of ignited this dream of mine to go and see the world. Now, Steve had a different dream, of course.
I was just going to ask you that. Did he dream of being an astronaut?
Well, Shannon has seen the pictures that he drew when he was in 3rd and 4th grade, right when NASA's space program started literally taking off. And there are pictures we have drawn in crayon by Steve, a picture of a rocket going up to the moon, and the title on the rocket says Steve and let's go fly. So he knew even earlier than I did what he wanted to do. We both wanted to explore, but he wanted to go a little further than me. So his dream for NASA existed quite a long time before I met him.
Well, what was it like being really newly married, just shortly married, and you have a husband who is planning to take off for outer space?
I think what I appreciate about Steve and our marriage is that from the very beginning we respected each other's dreams, because we did have those dreams long before we met each other. And he was quite supportive of what I wanted to do. He didn't demand that I move immediately down to Florida and become his spouse and give up my career dreams. So I quite appreciate that about him. You know, I think you could ask, what is it like to be married to an astronaut? And the answer would have to be, it depends, because there are lots of different astronauts. There are about 100 of them, and so I can only say what it's like to be married to my astronaut, our astronaut. But he's a really special person. He's very smart, very accomplished, but very friendly, very supportive, very excited about life, and that's contagious. And I didn't know much about the space program before I met him. And it's been wonderful the way he has shared his interest in the stars and astronomy and rockets and how aerospace works, not just with me, but with our children. He's really not forced that on them, but opened up a whole new world that I never would have known anything about without being married to him. So.
I understand that he was the first in his astronaut class to get a flight assignment.
Yeah, Steve's had good fortune. We moved to Houston with a group of 19 astronauts from the United States, and NASA that year also selected 6 Europeans, so 25 people. And he was the first one selected to fly, and he flew. And that first flight was probably the scariest one for me, because there's just so much to learn, and the wife has a big role in the flight also. You're expected as the spouse to host the biggest party you'll ever host in your life outside of your wedding reception. And lots of family and friends, of course, are interested in going down for the the launch. So there was just a lot to learn, and also to absorb and understand and accept the risk involved in the launch event itself.
You learned that firsthand with that first launch, didn't you? Or the first attempted launch.
Yeah, the first attempted launch was unfortunately ended with what they call a pad abort. And that's not a good vocabulary word to learn. You don't want to know about pad abort, because what that means is that the family and friends were all watching from about 3 miles away, and we saw them light the main engines, but before they light the solid rocket boosters to let the vehicle lift off, they have sensors that track to see if everything is okay. And one of the sensors said, "No, stop, it's not okay." So you had a situation where we saw the fire, we saw the ignition, but the rocket didn't take off, and we knew there was something really wrong. They shut everything down, but there were still a lot of sparks and flames, and you worry about all those millions of gallons of fuel. Anyway, NASA has practiced for this scenario, and they knew exactly what to do. The astronauts were unloaded from the vehicle. They broke quarantine. So the funny thing was that we had, of course, this post-launch.
What's quarantine?
Quarantine is what happens the week before launch. The astronauts are taken into a secure building where they can't come in contact with germs. So, for example, Shannon was not able to see her father for the week before the launch. And I, as a spouse, had to have a doctor's checkup every time before I went into quarantine to visit him. And the other thing about quarantine is they help the astronauts shift time zones. If they're going to do a night shift and a day shift of the crew on flight, they help that night shift start shifting time zones in that 7 days of quarantine. So the astronauts are in quarantine until the actual minute they step into the vehicle to launch. Well, this first launch didn't happen, so all of the astronauts broke the quarantine, got out, and they all attended the post-launch parties. So we had hundreds of guests that were very surprised but happy that Steve could be there to celebrate with them. But everybody had to come back then later, several weeks later, for the real launch.
It was about, month and a half, 2 months later, the actual month.
Yeah, 6 weeks later. Yeah.
And that launch was smooth, and his other launches have been smooth?
For the most part. You know, it's such a difficult and complicated thing to actually execute a launch successfully, because the weather has to be right, not just in Florida, but in the alternate landing places they have designated in Europe and Africa. In case something goes wrong right after launch, they have a scenario where they could land in Spain or Africa. So the weather has to be good in those places too. And then, of course, you have to have the whole vehicle with millions of parts all working correctly together. So it is a miniature miracle when everything launches correctly. And for the most part, his have gone more or less on time. Yeah.
He had 4 missions and multiple spacewalks. And as viewers, you know, we're very proud of the American space program. We're proud of our involvement in the International Space Program, and we look there and we see our astronauts out there. But you saw your husband, you saw your father out there during the launch, up in the mission itself, and actually on the spacewalks. What was that like?
Do you want to answer that, Shannon?
Well, it's a pity because I was very young during all 4 of the missions, so I don't remember a lot of the experience. I do remember just being totally excited for my father, that it was his dream since he was a little kid. And I do remember my friends all being, you know, "Wow, that's your dad up there." And yeah, I know, it's really cool.
Were your friends mostly children of other astronauts?
There were a few families in the area that we lived in. So a lot of my friends were daughters or sons of astronauts. More so than, of course, when we moved to Paris and Amsterdam.
And speaking of that, after Steve's missions into space, his spacewalks and all of that, he is no longer going up into doing actual flights, but he is still very much involved professionally with the International Space Program. What is it that he's doing now, and how does that involve the family?
Right. Well, now he is still in the astronaut corps, but he is using his educational background in materials engineering and manufacturing and processing in the role of product manager and also international liaison with the European Space Agency. So he's not in line for another flight, which is a sad thing for him, but he had 4 flights, which is unusual. I think the average is more like 2 or 3. So he's very grateful for that, and what he's doing now is he's sort of a lone ranger at NASA employee in Europe, and his desk is right in the offices with the European Space Agency. There are 16 countries that are part of this alliance for the Europeans, and they are building a fleet of vehicles that will take supplies up to the space station and bring the trash back down. So they're service vehicles, they're not manned. But they needed a NASA engineer to be there to check to make sure that as the Europeans build this vehicle, its functionality and its safety requirements are being met. And Steve has that educational background. So when he knew he wasn't going to fly anymore, he was happy to raise his hand and say, I'll take my family over to Europe to do this job. And of course, I was right behind him.
I say that fit right in with your plan.
Such a good idea, Steve. Yeah.
Where are you living now?
We lived 4 years in Paris, and then the project moved to the next stage, and we moved to Holland because that's where the logistics headquarters is for the European Space Agency. So we were in Paris from 2003 to 2007, and then we moved to Amsterdam. So we've been in 2 big European cities, which is quite interesting.
Well, Shannon, I'd like to ask you, because you would have been in grade school when you were living in Paris.
Yes.
What was it like? Did you get to school the first day and not know how to say a word, or did you know a little bit of French before you got there?
Well, we had taken a few months because we knew we were going to move to France. So we knew how to say hello, goodbye, thank you in French. But luckily we went to an international school, so everyone there spoke English. But we did have to take French each day at school.
Were you living in an international community, or were you living right among Parisians?
No, we were living right among Parisians in the 17th district, just in an apartment, so all our neighbors were French, and we got to know them.
How different was it from living in Houston or Florida or San Jose or Wadsworth?
Well, I grew up in Houston, and then moving to Paris, it was a big change. There's so much going on in Paris, and I'm really happy that I got this experience because everyone hears about Paris, everyone wants to go to Paris, and just the history and just the other culture is really exciting.
Well, while you've been living in Europe, you've had the opportunity to go really all over Europe, and I think you've been to Northern Africa and Egypt. Tell us a little bit about the kind of travels you and your brother too have done.
Yes, every school vacation we would go to some new country all over Europe, and it's very easy too because the countries are so close to each other, and the Europeans have made it easier to travel between European countries. We've also been to Africa, and it's a good experience just to see, just how everyone lives in their own country and how they react to Americans coming. And it was really a great experience because all the countries we've been to, just the people are so nice, and we've seen so much history. So it was a good experience for both Brian and I.
How long have you been living in Holland now, and what's it like? Are you seeing differences between going to school in Paris and going to school in, I think you're right outside Amsterdam now?
Yes, it's our 3rd year here, or in Amsterdam. And now that we live in just outside of Amsterdam, we live in a house so we can have a dog, and we live in an apartment in Paris. So it is a bit different living right in the city as opposed to living a few minutes outside. But one thing I like about living in Amsterdam, right outside it, is the Dutch. They ride their bikes everywhere. So it really, it's green, and it gives me more liberty, and it's a good thing that the Dutch do. And in Paris, we brought our bikes to Paris, but we only went biking a few times. So it's a nice thing that the Dutch do, and it's very different. Of course, we had to ride the bus to our school, 40 minutes on the bus, but it just takes me 12 minutes to get to school on bike.
Well, that makes it a lot easier. What are extracurricular activities like in the different countries?
The European schools do not have sports in their school system, so I joined, for example, volleyball and a basketball team, a French volleyball and basketball team when I lived in Paris.
A club, not connected with the school.
Oh.
Yeah, and I've also done that with the Dutch, so I'm on a Dutch volleyball team. But also in the school, they offer tutored languages and art classes, and of course they have sports teams. So it's similar to going to school here, but just with many different countries involved.
Of all the countries that you visited, what do you like best?
That's a hard question. Yeah, I'd have to say I really liked our Egypt trip. That was a few months ago, actually, in April. And we got there just before it got too hot. We saw the pyramids, we saw numerous so much history there, and so much more. But not only the history that we saw there. Just the Egyptians were so nice, and it's a beautiful country, really. And everyone has dreams of going to Egypt too.
I think one of the nice things about that trip, and also about
that was a few months ago, actually, in April. And we got there just before it got too hot. We saw the pyramids. That was a few months ago, actually, in April. And we got there just before it got too hot to be there. But there's so much history there, so much more than in Amsterdam and even here. You know, we saw the pyramids, we saw numerous tombs, but not only the history that we saw there. Just the Egyptians were so nice, and it's a beautiful country, really. And everyone has dreams of going to Egypt too.
I think one of the nice things